Okay, in this tutorial, we are going to cover the basics of global illumination, and we're also going to look at particle emitters and kind of some of the basics of how to use that so we can double up on what we're doing here. So let's start with global illumination and how that works. So with standard lighting set up in our render engine, all that happens is light goes from rays of light that come from the light source, hit the object and bounce back into the camera that we're viewing the scene from, are the only rays that get computed. And so what that can do is it creates really hard shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a floor. I'm going to create a sphere in the center, and we're just going to do a little bit of setup here to start with. And then I will create a couple planes as well. So I'm going to rotate this plane. What I want basically a back wall and a front wall and maybe some side walls real quick. So if you take a hot second to do this, we can all get this set up. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit. For some reason the floor is driving me crazy right now, but that's okay. And I'm actually going to change my display to hidden line right now because that's going to make seeing what I'm doing a lot easier with that ground plane. And then I'm going to use one of these. Put this back a little bit, maybe to there, rotate it 90 degrees. Okay, so I've created this space, and I've got my sphere here in the scene, and I'm just going to go ahead and create one omni light. And I want to go ahead and put that in the space as well. Now, ideally, I'd have like a lid on this or whatever, but that's not the important thing right now. The important thing is that we have these things set up. Now, the other things we need to do with the light is we need to go to the General tab, and we just need to turn on shadows. We could also turn on fall off, but we don't necessarily need to do that for this example yet. So once I've done that, let's go ahead and we're just going to create like a standard white material, not 100% white, but pretty close, just the default, and let's apply it to every single object in the scene. Drop it on the sphere and drop it on the ground plane. And I'm going to go back to change my display to garage shading lines. Okay. And you can see I actually have a gap there. So I'm going to try and close that off. There we go. So I've got this really simple, like, room, you could say. And so I'm going to go ahead and just render this. And when I render this, you'll see that the light source is here. I have light hitting this surface, hitting this surface, hitting this surface, and hitting the sphere. But you'll notice that how dark this back face is, right? Even though in a space this small, in the real world, light would bounce off this wall, bounce off the floor, and then illuminate, or bounce off the wall and hit here, and illuminate the back side of this object, making this shadow significantly less intense, right? And so let's go ahead and just, even with this simple scene, I'm just going to change the view a little bit. Let's go ahead and turn on global illumination so we can get a sense of what's happening. So if I go up to my render settings, and I'm in the standard renderer now, I'm going to go ahead and switch to physical. I'm going to select physical, and I'm going to change that from the sampler from adaptive to progressive. I'm doing this because it will just fill in the whole scene faster, and especially for a tutorial, it's a lot nicer than waiting for the whole thing to render. The other thing I'm going to do, in order to turn global illumination on, I'm going to go ahead and click Effect, and I'm going to go down to Global Illumination. So now that I've done this, let's go ahead and we'll see how quick this takes. It's a really simple scene that should go pretty fast. There is this preset that's this interior preview or exterior preview and object visualization preview. They set some basic settings, but it sets it super low, so it goes fast. Right now, we're just going to do the default setting. And I'm going to go ahead and render this again. Now you'll notice something different immediately. This is showing you where the calculations are happening. And as soon as this renders, you'll notice that the scene is much brighter, right? Light is bouncing all over the place, right? Any light that's coming here is at least bouncing one time, right? There's this, in the settings over here, there's this primary and secondary method, the samples, number, gamma, etc. And then there's some options here as well, but let me go ahead and render this again, right? And so this is just showing us how the different rays are hitting and being calculated, because it's not taking every single ray, because that would be insanely hard. So it takes, and it figures out, like, based on, the density of light or how bright the light would be in a space, it sort of calculates an area based on a single point. And you can increase the number of samples, right? So this is my samples are set to medium here. But what we get is a much more accurately and realistically lit scene, right? Because this shadow's a lot lighter. This is a lot lighter on the backside because the light that's bouncing off the wall is hitting these surfaces. So we've got this all set with standard white materials. So let's see what happens when we change one of these walls to a different color. So I'm going to go ahead and just double click to create a new material. I'm going to close my render settings. And I'm going to go ahead and change this color to, let's just say green. That's what was available. So I just made the saturation like 93%. It doesn't really matter how saturated it is. And I'm just going to apply it to this one wall because I know the light's going to bounce off this wall and illuminate the backside of this object. So let's go ahead and render that. So you can already tell, even in this view, something is happening, right? And what's happening is, and this is what happens in the real world, the color of the object that the light hits basically is, right, this is the color that's being reflected off the object. All other wavelengths are being absorbed. And so instead of just reflecting white light, it's actually reflecting this green light, and then the light goes from white to green when it hits these different objects. And you can even see, it's hard to see, but there's even a greenish tint across this entire space because the light's, bouncing around and filling in. And so this gives us much more accurate lighting, right? If I was to go ahead and let's do one other color. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do magenta just because it's so beautiful, and because everybody would want to live in a small box that has one bright green and one magenta wall in it, because that sounds like an awesome thing. And for some reason, oh, I set that on transparency. That's odd. Okay, so let's go to color. Let's go to the right channel. There we go. And let's go ahead and drop this on this wall. And so if I render this now, right, it might take a little bit longer, but you'll see that I'm getting this bounce back and forth, and there's magenta and green being cast on here. And so now you'll see that on the object, there's a mix of magenta and green. And you'll see that the shadow is more green, and that's because, right, the magenta is essentially being blocked, by the shadow being cast by this object. And the other thing is, right, we're not just getting like a bounce from the center of this, right? There's light that's bouncing off of all of this surface all over the place to hit this object. Okay, so this is the general way that global illumination works, is it works based on multiple bounces. And there's a lot more to it if we go to our render settings. There's a lot of different options out here. There's different methods. There's this irradiance cache, there's quasi-Monte Carlo, and there's this whole secondary method where if I was to say, let's look at the different presets and what they do, right? Because that'll kind of give us some hint. So if I go to interior preview, the primary method is a radiance cache, and the secondary method is radiosity maps. And so, and there's settings for each of these. It gets really dense. And you'll notice because it's a preview, my samples are set to low. So if I render this, it should go much faster. Right? It went really, really quickly. And that's because it's giving me a much lower quality result. But with the secondary method, it's actually what's happening is it basically does a couple of passes, and it allows for more color information to be transmitted accurately. Now, if I go from interior preview to interior high, what this does is it does the secondary method the same, and it uses what's called an irradiance cache. And it asks how much diffuse depth there is, gamma, etc. And so if I go ahead and render this now, this should take significantly longer to render. You'll see my samples are set to medium, so they're more dense. And it's just going to take a lot longer to render these passes. Now, how accurate you set your global illumination to is really dependent on your scene and your purpose, right? Global illumination can make anything better, but it also means that that it's going to take longer to render. And if you do these really high quality things, there's a point where you're just not going to see any better result. And it really just depends on what you're doing. If you're trying to do something photorealistic, you're probably going to want that to be as high as possible. And notice they have these other presets for like a high diffuse depth. So this maximum, they're doing light mapping as a secondary method. The maximum depth is 16. Right? If I render this in this simple scene, I'm probably not going to get too much difference. But you'll notice, right, with the light mapping on there, things look a little different. And it's going to take significantly longer to render. Oh, that wasn't so bad, actually. But then I don't have anything interesting going on in this scene. And again, you might be able to tell a subtle difference in quality. Where it's really going to make a difference is if you have transparent materials, if you have highly reflective materials, depending on where your sources of illumination are, can make a big difference. But again, you have to balance how long it takes with the quality that you get and whether or not you're happy with that, right? Even just having these objects have multiple, have green on this back surface and magenta on the front surface makes a big difference. Okay, so that's the basics of global illumination, right? It's not hard. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out which one you want to use, but fortunately, they have all of these presets. So when we go to use a physical sky, right, this is a good preset to use for physical sky. And so they give you a starting point and some hints in terms of how you do this. And if you're ever really wanting to know a lot more about this, you can't right. That's weird. You can't right click on it and get help. Maybe I can right click up here and get help. There we go. So if I right click on the title and say show help. It just goes to render settings. That's not... No, but here's global illumination in the menu right there. And there's a really, really elaborate and in-depth discussion of global illumination. They give you some basics. And then there's some other tutorials that really go deeper into this. It's something you can spend a lot of time with, but right, one of the things that you can do is you can get these really amazing natural lighting setups, right? And this is, one example here. I'm using something else. I'm using an omni light, which is a point light. But typically when you're working with global illumination, you want area lights tend to be more physically accurate in the way that most lighting comes into a scene. And so that's something to be aware of, is that, area lights are going to give you an even better representation of the light in the scene. So let's go ahead and just take our light that we have, go to general, change it from omni to area, and let's rotate this so that it's actually laying flat in our scene. and hit the letter E, and let's place it so that it's more centered and it's up at the top of our room. And then let's take our light, select our light again so we can get to the Details tab, and let's check mark Show in Render. We can also say Show as Solid in Viewport so we can actually see the area light. And then we can say Show in Reflection. And then we have, the visibility multiplier. We don't need to worry about that. If we just render it like this, and I can't remember what my render settings are set to. Oh, it's pretty high right now. So this might take a second, right? But this area light's going to give us an even better or more accurate lighting situation than we would otherwise have. Now, to make it even more accurate, I would need to adjust my fall off, right? But so this, you can tell, obviously I changed where the light was, and you can see that I should have lifted a little higher, but that's fine. Right, but again, this is giving me a much better representation of a light in this space. So if I go ahead and let's do the last thing, and let's just set our physically accurate fall off, right? And, depending on how intense this light is, we could make some adjustments. Let's say it's a really dim light. Let's just leave it here, and let's render this and see what we get. Right, you can already see it's going to be much darker in the scene. And it's thinking about it, right? Having fall off is significantly more complex, and we may not get enough light to actually like the scene up, but we'll see. Oh, there we go, right? So you can see that with this dim light, it's still giving us the color bounces and everything, but it is, right, significantly more dim. So these are, so this is the basics. So what else can we do with global illumination that we can't do normally? One of the ways that global illumination shines, is by allowing us to use what's it called? Allowing us to use the objects as lights, right? And so if we use the luminance channel on an object, I'm going to go ahead and turn luminance on here. You'll see that makes this wall completely white. I'm going to uncheck color. I'm going to uncheck, actually I'm going to leave reflectance on. I might leave color on too. And then I want to copy this color. So I'm just going to click on this arrow, I'm going to click on the box. I'm going to hit copy. I'm going to go to luminance. I'm going to right click on the box and hit paste. Right. And so now this is has luminance, and I'm going to go ahead and turn my light off in the scene. Right, so all I have right now is this wall, and if I go ahead and render this with the default settings, we'll see what happens. And we'll wait, and we'll wait. And I should probably throw this back onto a preview setting so it goes a little faster. Okay, so you can see that this wall, right, is now a light source. It's illuminating everything in the color of its luminance channel. And, there isn't a whole lot of brightness here, so I'm not getting much shadow on the other side. This wall is basically completely not illuminated. And so how do I adjust the intensity of this? So there's a couple different ways. First, in luminance, I can increase my brightness beyond 100%. So if I set this to let's just say 200%, right, and let's go ahead, because I'm going to be doing a lot, let's go ahead and change this back to interior preview. And let's just see, maybe we could say high diffuse depth interior preview. Let's just see if it goes quickly or poorly or what happens here. Okay, so, am I rotated? I don't know why. Right. So why is this green wall barely being illuminated? It's because the green, if only magenta light's hitting it, it's absorbing most of that magenta, right? And so it's actually, because it's green, there's nothing that's really reflecting because, right, it's all this magenta light. So that's why this wall is almost completely pitch black. But you can see, right, by increasing this to 200%, I get significantly more illumination. Now, there's another way. Now, sometimes what that does is it ends up changing your color, or if this is an object that you want to have some discernible surface texture, increasing the brightness here can be problematic. Like if I increase this to 400%, right, it's going to make it lighter and lighter and lighter pink, right? If I make it 800%, and obviously, right, it's basically white at that point. And that's not what we always want. So if I set this to 100% brightness to get that full saturation, and then I go down to illumination, and I come down here to generate GI, where it says generate GI, I can also turn this into a polygon light, which we can talk about a bit. But if I go to generate GI and I increase this to 400%, or let's go 800, because 800 made the wall white, right? But if I make this 800% and render this, right? This wall isn't white, right? It isn't getting brighter and brighter and brighter. It's staying the same color, but it's illuminating the scene more, right? And if I could also decrease or increase the saturation of the global illumination color, so if I set this to, 300%, I might actually oversaturate everything else, right? Like you can already tell, right? It's going to be really, really saturated with that color, right? So this illumination tab down here is another way that we can work with this. And sometimes it's a blending of the two, right? It's like, oh, well, I want the strength to be 400. Maybe the saturation's 150 because I want it to be bright pink in there. But, I also want this to really be brighter. I want it to look like it's glowing more so. And so I'm going to set this to 300%. Right? And so then when I render this, I should get, right, and maybe it's a little bit too much right now because it's blowing everything out completely. But you can see that this wall is, is this lighter pink color, and everything else is now like intensely colored. So let's set this to 200%. And let's change our illumination here. Let's make this 200 as well. And let's leave the saturation at 100. And so then I can go ahead and render this. Right, and so now it's giving, this is more what I was hoping to go for, right? This appears to be glowing, right? Because we're actually seeing that glow, right? That color change as it goes across these other surfaces, and it actually illuminates things with the color of the object, right? And so this is one of the other key features of global illumination, is that you can really have your objects light your scene, which is pretty amazing. And you can even get, some of that haziness. Now, there's other times you're not going to get quite the same level of glow in terms of like a haze around it without some post-processing going on. Okay, so let's see how this applies to some other settings. And then once we do that, we will go ahead and stop this tutorial, and the next one will mix the particle emitter with global illumination. Okay, so we've done all of these things. Let's go ahead and turn our walls off and leave our sphere on. Right, so we've got a sphere, we've got a ground plane. I currently have global illumination on, and if I render this right now, it's just going to be black, right? Nothing's going to show up, because when you turn global illumination on in your render settings, if you don't have any lights in the scene, you will not see anything, right? Whereas without global illumination turned on, there's like a default light that basically turns on and illuminates your scene when you don't have lights in it, right? So that's just something to note. That's a subtle difference. So let's start by looking at physical. Let's create a physical sky. So we've got our floor, we've got our sphere. Let's go ahead and create a physical sky. And with this physical sky, I'm going to leave it set to all the default settings, right? The time and location is currently noon in November. It's when I'm making this, right? That's the default time, is the current day and date, and time. So I could also, right, make this midnight or whatever, and then there'd be a star field. But let's go ahead, and we have global illumination turned on. Let's go ahead and render this. And you'll see that even without any lights in the scene, the physical sky, and actually the sun is actually behind the camera right now, which is why there's a shadow here. And so with nothing else in here, the physical sky is providing all of the illumination for the scene, right? If you're looking to get accurate exterior lighting, or even if you create like if you create a little box like a house and you have some holes cut in the walls for light for windows, right? You could have a physical sky outside of that, and the light would be streaming in. So let's just adjust. If I actually rotate my view a touch, right, you'll see that with the physical sky, there's actually a compass that shows up, and you can see that the sun is now behind the object, and so based on my camera angle, I've got a much lighter view. This is also really good for reflections. So if I was to create one more material and go ahead and let's go to reflectance and add a Beckman layer to it. And we're going to change the attenuation from average to additive. So we actually get that color through there, but we still have this reflectance on here. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this down to like 2% roughness. And then I'm going to go ahead and apply this to my sphere, not to my ground plane, because that'd be kind of a nightmare. But if I go ahead and render this now, along with my global illumination settings, I'm going to get an accurate reflection of the sky, right, in this view. So let's go ahead and look at what happens when we adjust our settings. So let's say, okay, actually maybe I want this to be, I don't know if this is 24-hour time. It probably is. So I'm going to say let's do 5 o'clock, which would be 1700 hours. Right, so you can see the lighting has changed dramatically, including the position of the sun. If I go ahead and render this now, right, you'll see that the ground plane is pretty black, right? And that's because the sun is probably just beyond the horizon. So let's make this 1600 hours instead. There we go. This should probably work a little bit better. Yeah, now the ground plane should have a little light and color to it. Yeah, right. So you can see that by adjusting the time, I can really adjust the way the color is applied to these objects. So I get a much more accurate representation. Okay, so with the physical sky, there's also, I can add a horizon line. There's all sorts of settings we haven't really talked about this at all. Under the details tab, I believe there's some place to show clouds. I can't even remember. I haven't used this in a while, but you can see that there's many different settings that we can use here. But by default, right, the sky, when you use global illumination, it becomes a light source. You don't have to do anything else to it. And the same goes for the normal sky. So if I go ahead and create a sky, and there's cloud tools, so you can make your own clouds. But if I go and create a normal sky that has, and turn off my physical sky, and I render this, even without a material, it should, right, it's just this, like, it's that dead gray color. And I'm going to get that same illumination. You'll notice there's no bright spot, and that's because, right, a normal sky, it's uniform color, right? So there's no hard shadows from a sun source. There's just an even gray light. If I was to make some adjustments to that, so let's go ahead and choose our material. We don't even have to use luminance to get this to illuminate the scene, right? We can just use the color channel. So if I go to texture, I go to noise, because we love noise, and I actually change the colors of this to, let's say, some like horrible green. This will be so, and a magenta, because that's, that's what makes us all happy here, right? And then if I increase the contrast some, and maybe I change the noise type to something a little more cloudy or wispy, wavy turbulence will probably do, and I increase the global scale to like, I don't know, 400%. If I just do that and apply this to the sky and render the scene, right, you'll see that the entire scene is being illuminated with, patches of green and purple light. You can see the shadow's a bit more purple here, right, because there's green blotches here, but there's probably, behind me, there's probably a big purple section, which kind of you can see over here. And so, right, so I can, create anything here. I could pull in an image, and there's actually plenty of three-dimensional or 360-degree images. They're typically called HDRI images. You can find some of those online. You can drop the image in instead of noise. You could drop an image in here, and then it will create this sky map that will allow you to have like a pretty accurate background behind what you're doing. So those are the basics of ways that you can use global illumination. If we, I'm going to do this and probably regret it, but if we go ahead and copy this shader and turn on our luminance and paste this shader in here, this should create an even more intense lighting situation. So yeah, it's totally blowing everything out now, right? It's there's barely any color in here because it's so bright. Right? If I turn off the color channel and just use the luminance channel, it should right, be a little bit more normal, right? It looks about the same. It's just when both of those channels are on, it adds them both together, and so it really blows that color out. In either case, you should, I'm going to test this with the color, but you should be able to go to illumination and increase or decrease the strength of that illumination. So let's say we set this to 25%, and I render this, right? I can't even see anything, so we'll see how luminous it is, right? So you can see that, right, the reflection is there, but it's so little illumination that everything is black. So if I increase this strength to, let's say 75%, let's see what happens then. Right, so now the scene is much more dimly lit. If I take my reflective material off my sphere and do the same thing, we'll get like an accurate read of how illuminated the top of this more bland material is. Yeah, so you can see, right, it's a lot dimmer because this is should be a white object. And again, if it's not bright enough at 100%, right, I can always go upwards in strength to say 200%. And I can much more brightly illuminate this, but then the sky isn't going to be blown out, right? It's just going to provide more lighting to the scene. Okay, so those are simple ways to use global illumination. I highly suggest you take some of your existing scenes and you go ahead and open them up, turn on global illumination on a preview setting in your render engine, in your window, and just see what the results are. See how different it can be. Especially if you have areas where you are having problems with like really dark shadows, this could really open that up. Okay, so for the next tutorial, we will look at using the particle emitter and doing some cool stuff with global illumination.